How's it going, everyone? Welcome to Mega Episode 8 of Chiptune Tech. My name is Anthony Hom. I think I have this podcast recording schedule more or less worked out. The plan is to work on Chiptune Tech every other month, writing and recording for it, while writing and recording for my other podcast, Between Two Pixels, the adjacent months. So you'll be getting new episodes of Chiptune Tech every other month, while getting new episodes of Between Two Pixels the months that Chiptune Tech episodes are not released. I have to apologize for audio in previous episodes of Chiptune Tech. Episodes 1 to 6 were recorded using a Zoom H2N in my high vaulted ceiling living room. Episode 7 was recorded in my makeshift recording booth, and there were some weird compressor settings that I thought that I worked out, but apparently they were still there when I was recording. Episode 7 probably sounded a bit blobby. The threshold was set a bit too low on the compressor, and hopefully now you get more of a dynamic range from my voice. All right, so with everything fixed, let's get on with the show. Chiptune Tech is created to disseminate information regarding the tech side of the house when it comes to chiptune hardware, mods, accessories, and all of the amazing innovations that people are doing to bring a brighter future to chiptune music. Nom is a collective of musicians, artists, tech heads, and writers with a passion for chiptune music, retro gaming, and old computers. We aim to share our information and passion with all of you. If you are interested in submitting audio, video, articles to Omnomnom, please send us an email at mikey@omnomnom.com. I'll have a link to the email address in the show notes. In these series of episodes, I've been going over a number of Gameboy consoles and how well they stack up when it comes to making chiptune music. In this episode, I'll be talking about the pros and cons of the Game Boy Pocket and Game Boy Advance. I'll also have a little bit of a bonus feature at the end talking about SNES RGB. Okay, so why the double feature, you may ask? I'm doing a double feature this episode because I don't have a whole lot of experience with producing on either a Game Boy Pocket or a Game Boy Advance Classic. I have modded many Game Boy Pockets and a few Game Boy Advance handhelds, but I have not done much in terms of music production with them. The Game Boy Pocket was the second Game Boy handheld offered by Nintendo. It was released in Japan on July 21st, 1996, and it was released in North America on September 3rd, 1996. The Game Boy Advance was the fifth Game Boy handheld offered by Nintendo. It was released in Japan on March 21st, 2001, and in North America later that year on June 11th. The Game Boy Pocket was the successor of the DMG-01 Game Boy and was succeeded by the Game Boy Light in Japan and the Game Boy Color in the rest of the world. The Game Boy Pocket accepted 2 AAA batteries and had an ever so slightly larger screen than its predecessor, the DMG-01 Brick Game Boy, whilst retaining the same resolution of 160 by 144 pixels. The Game Boy Pocket screen was more monochrome when compared to the DMG-01's greenish tinted LCD screen. The Game Boy Pocket's LCD screen is non-lit, so you'll be needing to play in a lit area or in good lighting conditions. Due to the Game Boy Pocket running on AAA batteries versus AA batteries, like the DMG-01, certain modifications to the handheld, notably a backlight screen, may cause the screen's contrast to fluctuate due to power draw of the backlight's LEDs. This is fixed with the use of an inline potentiometer to help reduce the brightness of the backlight or to install an inline resistor with the power lead in order to achieve a similar effect. It will reduce the brightness of your backlight, and it will also cut down the amount of power that it's drawing from your Game Boy Pocket. If any of you are familiar with inexpensive flash carts from around 2011, you'll have heard of the EMS 64M USB smart cards. There are some versions of these flash carts that do not play nicely with the Game Boy Pocket at all. Depending on when the cart was produced, you might experience heavy power drain on the Game Boy Pocket, rendering it pretty useless for music production. Heavy power draw or drain on any of the Game Boy handhelds may lead to distorted audio, screen contrast issues, or even data corruption on your song and the flash card that you are using. The EMS 64M USB smart cards in question that caused heavy power drain on the Game Boy Pocket handheld were produced on or before June 2010. Smart cards made in batches after this date had the issue fixed. I assume that it was a hardware revision that helped optimize the power draw from the Game Boy Pocket. If you own an EMS 64M USB smart card and want to know if you have an older version, if you look on the back of the flash card, there should be castings or etchings in the plastic with a 4-digit number followed by a letter. The first 2 digits reflect the year, while the second 2 digits refer to the month that the flash carts were made. The letter is the batch designation that the cartridge was made in. If you have any number higher than 1006A, you are good to go. Anything before that number or lower than that number, it would cause extremely heavy power drain on the Game Boy Pocket, and it would render it fairly useless when it came to producing chiptune music on. A way to avoid possible issues is to purchase an EMS smart card new or to avoid purchasing one at all. We have definitely come a long way in flash cart technology, but be sure that the flash cart that you purchase is compatible with LSDJ and its RAM requirements. Another way to deal with the low milliamp hour rating of the 2 AAA batteries in the Game Boy Pocket is to perform a battery mod. One of the mods requires replacing the battery compartments with a lithium-ion battery, a charging circuit, and a USB port for charging. I've heard of people also hooking up lithium polymer batteries in a series circuit with a charging circuit and a charging port. Before doing any of these mods yourself, I highly recommend doing some reading on batteries themselves, proper handling practices of these specific batteries, and how to properly install these batteries in hobby projects. Also, watch videos on YouTube on the subject. If you go with a lithium-ion battery pack, you want to make sure that there are no sharp pokey bits where you are installing it. Make sure the battery fits with a little bit of wiggle room to allow for expansion of the battery pack if it reaches higher temperatures. If a lithium-ion battery pack becomes punctured inside your Game Boy Pocket, it will become a hot pocket of flaming death. If you have not seen what a puncture does to a lithium-ion battery pack, look up some videos on YouTube. They might be small, but the contents become more than dangerous when exposed to oxygen. Something I really like about the Game Boy Pocket is its screen clarity. Even with just a backlight, the screen looks beautiful. This can be enhanced further with a bivert modification. In terms of audio quality, if memory serves me correctly, the sound of a Game Boy Pocket is a little thin when compared to a stock DMG-01. There's a gentleman by the name of Herbert Weichselbaum. I'm sure his last name is not pronounced that, but I am not familiar with the correct pronunciation of that, so we'll just call the homie Herbert. Okay, so Herbert has a website which I will link in the show notes. He has an audio comparison of all the Game Boy handhelds that he's able to procure. And he goes into comparing waveforms, comparing how they sound, and he compares stock unmodded Game Boys with modified Game Boys with the Pro Sound mod. There is another gentleman who goes by the name of Aqualux. He is an Australian chiptune artist, and he is making an updated version of the Game Boy sound comparison sort of list, and hopefully he gets it worked on in a little bit, but we'll see what's up. I saw some preliminary sort of pages about it. I'll see if I can link that in the show notes as well. According to Herbert's comparison, a Pro Sound modded Game Boy Pocket cuts down a little bit on the white noise in the audio signal, but it really doesn't do much else. A DMG-01 that's Pro Sounded, it's a night and day sort of change. While in a Game Boy Pocket, it's not as apparent, or it's not as huge of a boost than, say, like on a DMG-01. I would say that the Game Boy Pocket is super portable. I find it much more comfortable to hold than, say, the Game Boy Color. In terms of modding a Game Boy Pocket, it has a very form-fitting case, and it doesn't have a lot of places to add extra PCB boards or hardware inside of the case. From memory, I believe that there is a little bit of space at the top of the PCB, as well as to the rear of the PCB between the PCB and the case on the backside of the shell. The CPU is similar to that of the DMG-01, as it won't be able to handle super high BPM or intricate table commands very well or very accurately, and will freeze if too much is asked of it. I would recommend the Game Boy Pocket for people that enjoy the portability of it and need something quick to compose ideas and songs on. In terms of recording, if it is the only Game Boy you have, it's better than nothing. I really like the Pocket's form factor, but I can't say that I would personally use it to produce on. If it's your jam, it's your jam. Okay, now we'll be switching gears to the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance Classic came after the Game Boy Color and before the Game Boy Advance SP, which were the square clamshell Game Boys with the frontlit and backlit screens. The Game Boy Advance runs on two AA batteries. The Game Boy Advance came with a non-lit LCD screen. It also had a beefy 32-bit CPU running at 16.78 megahertz. The GBA is backwards compatible with original Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. The screen on the GBA was larger than handhelds previous to it at 2.9 inches with a resolution of 240 by 160 pixels. The layout of the GBA was a departure from the Game Boy Color with more of a horizontal setup. The D-pad, start, and select buttons were placed to the left of the screen, while the B and A buttons were placed to the right of the screen. The GBA also featured left and right shoulder buttons, which could change the aspect ratio of Game Boy and Game Boy Color games and programs. Due to the placement of the start and select buttons on this particular handheld, navigating the screens in LSDJ can be a bit tricky. If you are handy with a soldering iron and a craft knife, you can run jumper wires from the start and select buttons to the left and right shoulder buttons. I've personally done this mod in the past, and once you get the hang of it, you can actually navigate faster with the shoulder buttons on a GBA than with a traditional start and select button layout on previous generation Game Boys. I find more Nanoloop 2 producers using the Game Boy Advance than LSDJ users. Nanoloop 2 is actually specifically coded for the GBA hardware, while LSDJ, to my understanding, started life coded for the original Game Boy. Common mods I see Nanoloop 2 producers have on their Game Boy Advances include RCA Pro Sound, a backlit screen swap from a Game Boy Advance SP AGS 101, as well as a glass screen protector. I've seen a number of glass screen protectors crack due to the pressure of the LCD screen pressing up against the screen cover. I personally don't know if there's a way to get extra clearance between the screen cover and the actual LCD screen, but a way to prevent your glass screen from cracking is to not even use glass as the screen protector. You can get a replacement plastic screen protector, and that should do you just fine. The screen protector is that piece that's integrated with the case that covers the LCD screen. Herbert's audio comparison article also states that the GBA is a bassy Game Boy. Using a non-Pro Sound GBA that I have, I can confirm the article's description of a hum and whine in the audio signal when no music is playing. So when you're playing a track in LSDJ, you won't hear much of a hum or a hiss, but when you are paused and you're not playing any music whatsoever, you'll get a humming sound in your audio signal. I have heard that the ProSound mod makes the GBA solid for chiptune production. In terms of modding, the GBA's PCB uses SMD components, and there are a few areas to add things inside the shell. On the back of the handheld, to the left and the right of the battery compartment and the cartridge slot, there are rather large compartments inside of the case where you can add custom PCB boards or where you can route your wiring through. RCA jacks can be added to the top of the Game Boy Advance inboard of the left and right shoulder buttons. I recommend the Game Boy Advance for Nano Loop 2 producers or for LSDJ producers that prefer the ergonomics of the handheld. I say go for a Pro Sound mod if you can manage, and the backlight screen mod if you can afford it. The backlight screen will make producing on it a much more enjoyable and legible experience. Game Boy Pockets, in my history with them, have been the cheapest Game Boy handhelds to find, next to that of the Game Boy Color. I remember being able to find Pockets for $10 to $15 all day long on eBay. Game Boy Advances, in my experience, can vary a bit depending on condition. I've seen used Game Boy Advances go for $15 all the way up to $45. Most Pockets I've come across have their battery door covers. A lot of Game Boy Advances I've come across in the wild are missing their battery door covers, but they can be purchased separately from many different chiptune store vendors. Okay, here is the bonus portion of the podcast. A little bit on the update of things. I was originally planning on purchasing a super analog NT, but after crunching numbers, I decided to go for an SNES with an RGB SCART cable and a SCART to HDMI converter. With that being said, I had a Super Nintendo sent down to me so that I could make YouTube tutorial videos on the Om Nom Nom page. I'm using an Elgato Game Capture HD to record with and can record via the composite video signal from the SNES, but we'll be upgrading soon to RGB. A cool bit of information that I'm sure most of you out there in the land of video gaming know is that the SNES and Super Famicom supports RGB natively from the multi-out port on the rear of the console. To my understanding, all SNES and Super Famicom consoles came with composite audio video cables. These are the RCA cables with yellow, red, and white plugs. All SNES and Super Famicoms, with the exception of the junior versions of both, which I believe were also called the SNES 2, Super Famicom 2, or the SNES Mini or the Super Famicom Mini. All of the SNES and Super Famicom consoles, except for those, could support RGB with appropriate cables. With those, the junior models, the mini models, those could also support RGB, but I believe you had to install an RGB amplifier in them, and you had to get a specially designated SCART cable, which would be Sync on Luma. You can get component cables stateside for your NTSC SNES or Super Famicom from a company called HD Retrovision, and they are plug and play. They do make them in batches and they do go quick. As of recent, they were out of stock, and I haven't heard of any news about when they would be restocking. Another solution to getting RGB from your SNES is via a SCART cable. SCART, SCART, SCART connectors are beefy video audio connectors that, from my understanding, were mostly used in Europe. Retro Access in the US and Retro Gaming Cables in the UK build SCART cables for NTSC, SNES, and Super Famicom consoles. These SCART cables have a multi-out connector on one end that plugs into your SNES and a SCART connector at the other end. Unless your TV has a SCART port on it, you'll need to get a SCART to HDMI converter or a converter that goes from SCART to whatever input your TV or monitor accepts. There are a handful of different types of RGB, but you'll want to roll with the one that is RGB with C-Sync. Another type of RGB would be Sync on Composite, which you will not want. Another one would be Sync on Luma, and that specific type of RGB is only used for the SNES Juniors or SNES 2s or SNES Minis. You'll want to make sure that your RGB cables are specific to your region console, which would be NTSC or PAL. If you are using a console that is for North America or for Japan, it would be NTSC. But if you are using a console that was specifically marketed to the European market, it would be for PAL. You would need to make sure that your SCART cable would be RGB with sync on components, also known as C-Sync, spelled CSYNC. And for the converter that you're using, that goes from SCART to HDMI or SCART to S-Video or SCART to whatever you're using, for it to be RGB with C-Sync as well. Some SCART to HDMI converters say that they support RGB, but will only support RGB with sync on composite versus C-Sync. Sync on composite won't do you any favors in video quality because it will be essentially the same as composite video. You'll have a really weird looking cable that does composite video at that point. For SNES and Super Famicom 2s, minis, or juniors, you'll have to add an RGB amplifier board, which will help correct the brightness of the video signal. And you'll be needing to get a SCART cable specifically made for sync on Luma. The other way to get composite out requires you to have very specific models of the SNES or Super Famicom. There were a few revisions that had an S, E, and C chip, which you could tap directly for component video signals. Again, these only came in very specific versions of the SNES and Super Famicom. I'm this into it only because I'm a bit of a gear snob. I would like to provide good video quality and audio quality for the YouTube tutorial videos, but if push comes to shove, I'll just work with what I got. Composite video. I'll start out with some small videos showing some cool instruments, how to use different commands, and I'll be working up to translating the Null Sleep and Saber Pulse tutorials to a video format. There are videos on YouTube where a gentleman actually walks you through the steps of the Saber Pulse tutorial. And I want to make videos to bring more of an update to those videos on YouTube because if you get a chance to listen to them, I'll see about getting the links down in the show notes. The audio quality is not the best, and I kind of want to make more of an updated version of it. So big props to the homie that made those videos because you've inspired me. I don't think the video tutorials will translate very well into an audio-only medium like a podcast, but I think I'll make the effort to upload the audio from the videos to the podcast, so please stay tuned. I'll list some links in the show notes on the SCART cables from Retro Access and Retro Gaming Cables UK. I'll also list a link to HD Retrovision, which does the component cables for the SNES. And I'll also link to an article about SCART to HDMI converters that you should not purchase. So as of this recording, HD Retrovision has not had stock of their component video cables for the SNES. Retro Gaming Cables UK does have their SCART cables for the SNES and for the Super Famicom, but they do not have the Pack-a-Punch cables available. And I believe they said that pre-order was going to be very, very soon. So stay tuned for that. For Retro Access, to my understanding, it is a husband and wife team based out of Florida, which is on the east coast of the United States of America. And they are making each cable by hand, and they're shipping these cables out themselves. And with it being such a small operation, they do have very specific times for when they do sell these cables, which I believe is 7 a.m. Eastern time. And once they reach a limit, they will cut off orders for that day. So I believe it's a Monday through Friday, starting at 7 a.m. Eastern time. You should be able to purchase a SCART cable from them. All relevant links about topics I talked about will be listed in the annotations of this episode on omnomnom.com, and they will also be listed in the YouTube description of the video that's going to be placed on YouTube, and they will also be in the show notes of the podcast. If you have any questions, concerns, or comments, we'd love to hear from you. Please send us an email at mikey@omnomnom.com. That's MIKEE at OHMNOHMNOHM.com. Let us know what you think about the podcast. Let us know what kind of songs you're working on and like what kind of Gameboys you're using. If it's not too much of a bother, if you are listening to this via iTunes, if you could give us a 5-star review, it would really help get exposure for this podcast to other people that might be interested in listening to it. If you're into video game history, please consider giving my other podcast, Between Two Pixels, a listen. If you like current anime, please consider giving Reanimator Pod a listen. That is REANIMETOR Pod. I do the audio for those guys on a weekly basis, and I master all their audio files. All right, that's it from me for this episode of Chiptune Tech. Thank you very much for listening. And again, happy modding.